Welcome, everybody. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. Thank you all for joining us today in our second installment of our training series this month in honor of Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for wanting to learn about this important subject. Thank you for the work that you do and being a part of our community. This webinar is going to focus on human trafficking and family law. It's really, really cool. It's really about that intersection and really trying to empower our family law, legal aid attorneys and advocates to do everything they can to competently and zealously represent one of their survivor clients when they're a survivor of human trafficking. So it's really awesome content, not only because of just the subject, but of course because of the speakers who we have here today. I'm really honored to share this platform with two of my Florida Legal Services advocates, my favorite people to share a platform with always. So before we go into the content, I always want to give some housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, this is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent to you all via an email from Zoom. That'll come within 24 hours, not from me, from Zoom. But of course, I'll put my email into the chat. If you don't see that in your box or it went to spam, you can always email me directly and I'll get you that recording. Second, the recording, the email that you receive will come also with the CLE code. Yes, you heard it. This was approved for CLE credit through the Florida Bar. And I will announce that code at the end of the content. I will also drop it in the chat and you will receive it in that email along with this recording. So don't worry, you'll get your code, you'll get your credits. Third piece of housekeeping announcements, questions and answers, please drop them into the chat or the Q&A. I know it's tough. I know it's tough to feel engaged when we're on webinars in the virtual vortex, but this is a really interesting subject and really, kudos to my colleagues for pioneering this conversation on the intersection of human trafficking and family law. So undoubtedly, there's going to be a question that you might have, so don't be shy. This is the time to pose it and get the answer that you're looking for. And the last thing I want to say is we have a lot of content here today. We're scheduled to be here till 1:30. It may run over 1:30. If you have to hop off and we know you are very busy and have to go back to what you're doing, don't worry, you'll still receive that recording so you can jump right back in to pick up where you left off or to just watch from the beginning again if that's what you need to do. And so final piece, closed captions are on always. Sometimes I forget, but I did put them on in advance. So the closed captions are on for anybody who needs that extra accessibility. Again, if it's not enough, if you need something more, I'm putting my email into the chat. Reach out to me. I'll do anything I can to onboard you. And the last thing I should say, I am running the PowerPoint today. So that will prevent me a little bit from being as responsive into the chat or the Q&A. I'll do my best, but please just be aware that I'll be running that, so that's going to take away from my my focus on both things. All right. So with that being said, I am absolutely honored to introduce our speakers that we have here today. We have Emily Calvin, who works with Florida Legal Services as a staff attorney on the Survivor Services Project, where she provides legal assistance to survivors of violence in a wide array of family and civil matters. She previously worked at the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence and began her legal career at Three Rivers Legal Services, representing survivors of violence in injunctions for protection and related family cases, and eventually serving as the managing attorney of their Lake City office. Emily has extensive expertise in empowerment-based advocacy and trauma-informed services, and a passion for using those skills to serve survivors of violence. We also have with us Bette Collazo, who serves as the project manager for Florida Legal Services Human Trafficking Capacity Building Project spanning Central and Northeast Florida, which provides legal assistance and pro bono services to survivors of trafficking in areas of family law, immigration, and victims' rights. Bette lives in Orlando, where she has been advocating for and assisting survivors of domestic violence in various forms of abuse within low-income populations since 2016. So again, I am incredibly honored to share this platform with you, Bette and Emily. I'm incredibly honored to work with you, and I'm really excited to learn from you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you for the statewide training initiative for helping put this training together. Alexis, thank you for the guidance. I'd also like to thank Brandy Dieterle-Verdati. She's a consultant that is through the project. It's through the OVC SATA project, but they've really been instrumental in helping to shape the kind of presentations that we're able to provide you all. So, and thank you obviously to my co-presenter, Emily. Thank you. And thank you all for being here today so that you can learn about human trafficking. Alexis, if we can have the next couple of slides. That's us. Hi. So I'm going to talk about the importance of, hi again. Next slide. Yeah, the importance of human trafficking. It is a rising issue. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it is a major issue that's more prevalent and than people realize. And not only that, but it's gaining more attention in the news. You're seeing the posters at the airport. And a lot of people have questions about what that is, and we'll address those. We'll also be looking at the intersection of human trafficking and family law, so that if you do find that in your cases, you can help assist the survivors. And finally, that survivors of trafficking, human trafficking, have various legal needs. If you guys are in nonprofits, you know that that our clients usually have a tsunami of needs. They have various needs, and we want you to be able to recognize what some of those may be so that you may be better equipped to refer.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So as Bette explained kind of why we're here, what our goal is for today, I'll talk specifically about what we plan to cover today through our agenda. We will start with understanding human trafficking. We'll go through the laws, federal and Florida laws, and then we'll move on to identifying vulnerabilities in human trafficking. And then we'll get into the specifics of family law issues that are faced by trafficking survivors, you know, kind of the meat of what we're here for, the trafficking and how it relates to our family cases. And then we'll do a brief overview. We're not going to get into a lot of details about the other legal needs, but kind of touching on what some other needs to keep an eye out for, to let you all kind of know what to look for and who to refer to and all of that. And then we'll finish up with some tips and strategies on working with survivors of trafficking and trauma and how we can best support them in our practice.
Exactly. Thank you, Emily. So our first learning objective is going to be, next slide, please. Thank you. Our first learning objective is going to be understanding human trafficking. What is it? And also what its relationship is to family law, where we might see it in family law. We're also going to identify human trafficking in cases, and it's really more identifying human trafficking vulnerabilities in cases, and also being able to make those referrals when you spot someone, right? When you identify that there might be someone that needs help. And then we're also going to look at, you know, what those other related, legal needs may be and who they need to be referred to. And we're also going to provide you with strategies for representing survivors. Emily is really going to get into that later.
Yes, thank you. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Before we jump into the substantive content of our presentation today, we did want to start off with a few content warnings. You all are here for a human trafficking presentation. I think you can expect some of this stuff, if not all of it, but we did want to just make sure you knew what you were getting into so that you could make sure to check in with yourself, take care of yourself, and be in a place that you can receive the information that we are providing in the most, effective way possible. So we will be talking today about sexual assault, child physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence, sex and labor trafficking, and involuntary servitude, and all kind of things related to those issues.
Yes, and one other warning I'd like to make is on the choice of language. We'll be using the term slavery throughout the presentation as well, and that is not meant to talk about or encompass historical or chattel slavery. That is a separate and distinct thing. However, people that have survived human trafficking also, using the term slavery to define it is also accurate for the situation that human trafficking is, or for what human trafficking is. So just be aware that it's a sensitive word, but we'll be using it because it is in the statute, okay? Yep. Next slide, please. Okay, so first steps are going to be to understanding human trafficking law. We're going to start looking at the definitions and the types of human trafficking. and also some of the vulnerable populations and recruitment strategies that are used. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so we have several layers, and they all started around 2000. It started with the international, the international laws and the international setting. It started in 2000 during the Palermo Protocol, and that was to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And that was supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, in the United States, at the national level, they passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And that was enacted for the protection, prosecution, and prevention of human trafficking. And also the word partnership was added. And that's why when we talk about finding your partners and connecting with working with other partners, that's embedded into the statute itself. That was back in 2009 during the 2009 TVPA Reauthorization Act. So sometimes you'll hear it referred to as TVPA. Sometimes you'll hear me say TVPRA, but I'm still referring to the same thing. It has been reauthorized a total of 5 times. And then we have the Florida laws that are broader in a lot of senses, but in some other ways there are some distinctions. But it defines human trafficking as transporting, soliciting, recruiting, harboring, providing, enticing, maintaining, or obtaining another person for the purpose of exploitation of that person. Okay, next slide, please. Now, looking at the federal law, and we're really digging deep into the federal law, one, because that's where most of the Florida laws, that's where a lot of the state laws tend to mirror the federal laws, but also because you may not be breaking the law or not trafficking under Florida law, but you may be under federal law. And for immigration purposes, if your client has any needs, they're certainly going to need to be looking at these standards if they're trying to get any kind of immigration relief due to trafficking or any other form of violence. So severe forms of trafficking in persons is defined as forced labor. So 2 categories. Forced labor is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. There's the word we spoke about earlier. Or the other form, a severe form of trafficking in persons, is sex trafficking, is a recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained the age of 18. So for minors, you don't have to show that how, the means to get them into the scheme. The fact that they're participating in a sex trafficking scheme just by itself is enough. You don't have to show that element. Next slide, please. Okay, so the legal analysis we're going to be looking at today. I know that this is not the most exciting part. We're just, we're talking about the elements of human trafficking. We're looking at the laws, but more than anything, I want you guys to walk out of here today by understanding what it kind of looks like, and then when it might be time to refer, but also understanding what some of the mechanics are, right? Why the people are, or why the survivor is acting. So we're going to be looking right now at the ends mean process or action model. Now, this model was created by CAST, and it goes through the federal definition, right? CAST is the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking. They're based out of California, and they are the TTA provider, I believe, for OBC. But they're partners in helping to train us. And the next slide is theirs. But what they do is that in order to prove trafficking, they do the analysis backwards. Whereas, like, if you show that there is an end purpose, right, where the person is now one of those things, debt bondage, and we'll go into it in a second. The end purpose is what the trafficker wanted. The means is what the trafficker did to get the person into that situation. And then the process action is how they did it, how the trafficker maintained the person in that scheme. And then the next slide shows us that little chart that I spoke of. I absolutely love this. The link is at the bottom, and I believe we are providing the presentation, correct, Emily? We are providing the presentation.
We absolutely can. Yeah,
because then they'll have, yes. And then if anybody wants to learn more about human trafficking or for your organizations, CAST is a great resource and you can contact them. But here we go. See, this fits the definition that we were speaking about earlier. And we have, what's the end purpose? Now, so we end up with somebody in involuntary servitude, right? So now what we have to find is what was the means that was used, and what was the process that was used, or the process action taken at that time to get them in that situation. So long as you have one of each of the columns, right? So then now we're looking at trafficking, and you see that having one of each in the yellow section says intention of the trafficker, because it shows by the fact that, this is what happened at the end, and this is what you wanted, and this is how you did it. So now we have the intention of the trafficker, which is imperative to being able to prove human trafficking cases. So fraud does have a little asterisk, because when it comes to involuntary servitude, there has to be more than fraud. It can't just be fraud. There has to be something else keeping the person in the trafficking scheme. Okay, and we'll look at some examples later. Oops. Out of my slide. We are going to be looking at some examples in a little bit where we'll be testing some of this. The end purpose, involuntary servitude, it's general forced labor. It requires coercion, and it also encompasses slavery, which, as we know, is the antiquated definition. Debt bondage or bonded labor, right, is where somebody has, they've been tricked into working for little or no pay, and they're paying off a debt. You also have sex trafficking, which requires commercial sex in exchange for something of value. Now, note that that's a little bit different, right, than for a commercial purpose, as in labor trafficking. Something of value could be, a place to stay. Something of value could be not having your child hurt. Something of value could be something less tangible than just money exchange, okay? And the means of force is not defined in the TVPA, but obviously you all know what the definitions are, and you guys can find this as well. Fraud is the knowing misrepresentation, but again, that's not enough for involuntary servitude. You have to show that there was something else to keep them in that. And Florida law for the process and action, remember I said that there were some distinctions. Florida law defines human trafficking as transporting, soliciting, recruiting, harboring, providing, enticing, maintaining, or obtaining another person for the purpose of exploitation of that person. So we can add more columns when we're doing an analysis for Florida. Unfortunately, the definitions vary a little bit, as we'll see a little bit further on, but they don't exactly match the federal ones. But usually if there's enough for a case in Florida, there might be enough for a case federally. Next slide, please. And now we get to coercion. That was one of the 3 prongs, right, in the middle. And coercion under the federal definition is any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm to or physical restraint against any person, not just themselves, but any person, right? Their kids, their spouse. That would be and that's defined under 18 U.S.C. 1589 C2. Now, threats of serious harm under the federal law, and I'm making this distinction because Florida doesn't do it the same, is any type of harm, whether physical, psychological, financial, or reputational, sufficiently serious under all surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and circumstances to avoid to act or to avoid acting to avoid harm. And then the last prong of the coercion, we have the threats of serious harm. We've gone over scheme and pattern, and now abuse of the legal process. And if there's any domestic violence injunction attorneys here, or anybody that works at the shelters, anybody, you guys know, you guys see this, right? Where the people use the legal system and they file motions that don't have merit, or they're filing an injunction in retaliation to the survivor's injunction. But abuse of the legal process is defined as use or threatened use of legal process, of any legal or legal process, whether administrative, civil, or criminal, against the survivor in any manner or purpose for which the law was not designed to exert pressure, to cause that person to take some action or refrain from taking some action. So, yeah, and now the Florida law is more focused on either economic harm or physical harm. And they also have provisions for withholding of documents, but they don't really provide, coercion is not a cause of action when you're talking about reputational harm. Next slide. I know that this is a lot of information, guys, but thank you guys for being here today and learning about this stuff. Now, there are certain populations that are at an increased vulnerability for human trafficking. If you guys do work for nonprofits, they're usually your clients too, or you probably serve some of the same populations: victims of domestic violence, migrants and accompanied minors, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, unhoused individuals, people who have substance use disorder and addictions, systems engaged youth and children. All of these are vulnerabilities. So if you have combinations of these, you're extra vulnerabilities. LGBTQ+, persons with disabilities, mental health, women and girls, economic vulnerability, where people may be exploited due to their financial situation, polyvictimization. If somebody has been victimized in the past, they're more likely to be victimized in the future. Workers in informal and unregulated businesses for labor trafficking, orphaned minors, humanitarian crises and disasters, and undocumented or stateless individuals. Now, just because I don't want you to, now that I've explained to you some of the people that have increased, some of the persons that have increased vulnerabilities, I don't want you all to think, oh, well, Betty said women and girls. Well, no, boys get trafficked too, LGBTQs get trafficked, and even people that have none of these vulnerabilities can be trafficked. So, and we'll talk about, how people get trafficked, but just understand that just because they don't have vulnerabilities doesn't mean that trafficking may not be there. Next slide, please. Oh, so now I'm going to talk about some of the recruitment strategies. So I'm going to start with the last one, okay? Because that's the one that is most depicted in media, right? In that movie that came out last year, I don't even know the name because I didn't watch it, or in Taken, where you have, Emily, you can pipe up, what's the name of it?
The Sound of Freedom. That one.
Oh Lord, yes. No, that's not a very good representation of what human trafficking looks like. There's a lot of criticisms within organizations that work with survivors of human trafficking, and particularly because it really depicts it as not a national issue, right? And additionally, that forced recruitment is the thing we have to be worried about. And I get those things on TikTok, or somebody forwards me something like, look, this is about human trafficking. They're like putting things in people's cars and they're marking their cars and they're trying to kidnap them or whatever. Like, I honestly haven't heard of, not to say that couldn't happen, but that's not what human trafficking looks like. They're not going to kidnap you or your family members. I mean, knock on wood now, right? Now that I said it, but that's not what it looks like generally. That accounts for less than 2% or 0.2% of the cases reported are forced recruitment or kidnap based. So what you will see more of is romantic relationships, Romeos, right? You're like building a business together, or you're just like, they're paying for all your utilities and all your stuff. And then now you have to help me take care of the family. I've done this for you. You need to do this for me. And that accounts, human trafficking, we don't have a lot of statistics that are consistent or reliable. But what we can say is that this is a favored form of trafficking, and it's trending because it takes a little bit of time for the traffickers to completely take, somebody and get them into that frame of mind where now we're together, it's us against the world, takes 2-3 months of time investment, giving that person everything. And then after that, they could traffic them for 2-3 years, because that loyalty that's built, it's really, it's really problematic. But that's one of the ways that it can happen. There's also, and that's all types of trafficking. It could be labor trafficking or sex trafficking under romantic. False job offers, same thing. Some people get lured here with offers for employment and that just don't pan out, that are fraudulent. We also have familiar trafficking, and how I said all the statistics are, I would say they're all made up in human trafficking, mostly because it's underreported. But from the things that are reported, 40% of human trafficking of children domestically is through familiar trafficking. So that's, somebody that the children know. Friendship and grooming, that's the very next prong. It might not be the family, but it might be the family's friend, or it could be a teen friend, or it could be a teen boyfriend, or the friend of a friend that gets them to a party and then gives them some drugs, and or takes some inappropriate pictures. And for teens in particular, blackmail and threats and online recruitment, that's on the rise, both because they'll get them to do some things that compromise them, and now they're breaking the law, and now they're saying you have to continue providing me these videos or escalating or whatever. Emily?
And Bette, I just wanted to add too, just that, in what you're saying about the forced recruitment being really the least prevalent form, it exists, of course, but it is the one that we see focused on a lot in the media. And the reason it's not just, oh, that barely ever happens, so don't talk about it. But I think it's really dangerous that the focus is on that, because then we're missing all of the other types of trafficking by people that people know. The whole stranger danger thing that really is very sensationalized, I think, then it's a distraction from what's really happening. And then we're not able to identify what, a large amount of the trafficking going on, because we're looking for that, that taken, that like someone in handcuffs ripped from their family. But that's so infrequently what is happening, that if we're looking for that, we're missing most of what's happening under our noses.
Absolutely, Emily. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for bringing that up. But human trafficking recruitment strategies are diverse and can vary depending on the traffickers, their targets, and the specific content. Yeah. Traffickers use manipulation, deception, coercion to exploit their victims. So it can look a lot of different ways. So understanding these recruitment strategies is crucial in helping to combat human trafficking. Now, these are some of the common ones when we're talking about sexploitation of teens. Everybody spoke about that one. But I guess I skipped over isolation and emotional manipulation. But people that have been working with survivors of domestic violence, we probably recognize what this looks like, right? This is when we're talking about the total control of someone. And they're like isolating them from family. They're turning them against other people. I'm the only one that really cares about you. We can build something together. It's you and me against the world, and everybody else is against us. And, then when the survivor starts feeling like they really want to get out, they have no one to turn to. They may have even stolen from these people, depending on whatever the influence is, because, we'll talk about what the additional vulnerabilities are and the methods, right? But drug use is one of them. Once they get them into the scheme, now they're taking drugs, and they're saying, you're taking drugs, you're breaking the law. Or if they're doing sex work, oh, you're breaking the law. Sex work's illegal. You're breaking the law. So, you're still under my thumb. Mm-hmm. That's it. And the next slide, please. So a lot of you on this webinar today are probably going to be familiar with the domestic violence power and control wheel. This one has been tweaked from the original. It's based on the original, right? But it talks about the sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and it has the trafficker at the center with the power and control. But as you can see, the methods, right? Coercion and threats to harm the family or victims, threatens to expose or shame the victims, to report them to police or immigration, They use intimidation tactics, harms for others, destroys property, lies about police involvement in investigations, emotional abuse, humiliating them, calls names, makes them feel guilty, convinces the victim that they're at fault for what's happening to them, right? Isolation that keeps them confined away from family members, denies them learning the local language, doesn't let them work, denies access to children or friends or family, denying, blaming, and minimizing. It makes light of the abuse or exploitation. And Emily's going to talk a little bit about this, I think, later on in the part of the presentation as a tactic. But, you know, it's the gaslighting, right? It places the blame on the victim. And a lot of times it takes time for us to be able to even get to a point where we can help the survivors, because they're, as far as they're concerned, they've done it all wrong and it's their fault that this is happening. They can use sexual abuse to keep people, to keep their victims in line, physical abuse, not just physical abuse, but also in inducing drug addiction and forcing pregnancies or abortions, right? Using privilege, treats the victim like a servant, uses gender, age, or nationality, or, I'm going to have you deported, you're not from here. And economic abuse, creates a debt that can never be repaid. And this one's important because, like I said, Florida really recognizes this as one of the types of coercion for human trafficking. So prohibits access to finances, limits resources to small allowance, takes the money earned.
Yes.
But
And
if you guys Google, you guys can find this too.
I just wanted to note too, as you mentioned, Betty, that this is it's modeled after the power and control wheel related to intimate partner violence. And for those of you who are familiar with that wheel, a lot of these spokes, if not all of them, are very similar, but that outside where in the power and control wheel, it's physical and sexual violence. This is sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So it just shows, I guess my point is that it often can look very similar and there's a lot of overlaps between intimate partner violence and human trafficking, but that goal, that end purpose that we looked at the analysis earlier, it's more commercial, more financial benefit or something. It's a different purpose, but they look very similar. There's going to be a lot of overlaps in how it looks.
Correct. And actually, yeah, I skipped mentioning that part, where the outside of the wheel has sex trafficking at the top and labor trafficking at the bottom. But it talks about it, labor trafficking in businesses and farms, domestic work, begging, peddling, that can be labor trafficking, stripping, or sex trafficking, street online prostitution, residential, commercial, front brothels, truck stops, and other forms of sex work. So that's what they're getting out of them, and the inside is how they're doing it and how they're keeping the power under control.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we'll go to the next slide, please. And so now we're going to dig into identifying survivors of human trafficking. We know somewhat what it looks like and what to look out for. And now we're going to talk about, the role of the family law attorney in recognizing and supporting survivors of human trafficking. We're going to explore some framework for identifying human trafficking, and then we're going to look at some common misconceptions and challenges related to this so that we know what to look out for and we're not falling into these, common pitfalls of missing what's right in front of us. So we'll move on to the next slide. So we're going to start, we've got a couple slides here on the role of family law attorneys in recognizing and supporting survivors of human trafficking. This first slide's a little bit kind of in the initial consultation and when you meet your client for the first time. Well, I guess before you meet your client, the first thing you want to do is stay informed of the laws. That's what you're doing today. You're here. Keep attending trainings like this. Make sure you're continuing to educate yourself on the ever-changing laws about human trafficking, so that you can really know what to look out for and identify it and support your clients that have gone through that. And then when you meet your client for the first time, you're going to do an initial assessment. And during that initial consultation, it's beneficial to ask open-ended questions about things like the client's living situation, their employment, their relationships, and try to really pay attention to whether there are any unusual or potentially coercive circumstances surrounding what they are telling you. You're not just going to ask, are you a human trafficking victim? And Betty's going to explore some better ways to screen and talk about and ask questions to figure out what's really going on. It starts at the beginning. In that initial assessment, you start screening for this, in addition to, you know, all the other things we're screening for. And we have to keep an eye on it throughout the relationship, throughout the representation, to make sure we're identifying it as it shows up.
Emily, that would not be a very productive question, because most people would probably not, self-identify. A lot of survivors are not even aware that they are being trafficked. So that, yes, we'll definitely talk about that later.
Right. And that's the bottom line, right? It's hard for people to identify it when they're in it. So it's absolutely hard for us to see it from the outside too. And so that's why we have to work with our clients to recognize what they are telling us and what that fits under within the law, and how we can best support them through that process. Because you're right, Betty, they're not going to come in and say, I'm a human trafficking victim, I need legal services related to that. So, we, as attorneys, we know a client comes in, they dump a bunch of facts on you, and you have to figure out what the issues are, what's really going on, and what the legal, strengths and weaknesses are of their case. So this is just another tool in your toolbox of what to identify and how to approach these situations. Recognizing vulnerabilities, Betty mentioned. We had that slide that Betty talked about of a lot of the vulnerabilities. Of course, as Betty said, just because someone is not on that list of vulnerabilities doesn't mean they can't be a victim. And just because someone does have several vulnerabilities doesn't guarantee they are a victim of trafficking, but it is something to recognize and look out for, and just kind of have your feelers up and pay attention to what might make someone more or less vulnerable to being trafficked. Observing behavior. So that's really about paying attention to, especially how the client interacts with other people. If they bring someone to their meetings, of course, as attorneys, we need to always make sure, this kind of goes into maintaining privacy too, that we meet with the client alone for the sake of attorney-client privilege. And in that meeting, it is important to talk to the client, make sure that they understand if they want someone else present for your conversations, that they provide informed waiver of attorney-client privilege, and that you pay attention to how is this person talking over them? Are they not letting the client finish a sentence? Are they speaking for them? And a lot of times what I'll do is kind of put the blame on me. Like, if a client comes with another person, I greet them and I say, for my legal requirements, I need to meet with the client alone. And then after we have a conversation, we can bring you in if that seems necessary or appropriate or whatever. Just kind of put it on me, and me as the attorney. This is my role and my job, so that we can maintain some of that privacy, and I can observe the client when they're alone with me. And then if they do want this other person in at some point, I can observe them around the other person and just kind of see what the differences are in how they interact and how they communicate with me as the attorney. And just kind of observing observing all of that to see what those dynamics really look like. Maintaining privacy, I kind of talked about that. Of course, also making sure that they know, if you're going to share information within your firm, but of course they have confidentiality. Nothing's going to leave the office. This information I might have to share, this I won't. Just making sure they understand what they can expect from you, any limitations to your privacy, to their confidentiality and things like that. And then collaborating, of course, if you suspect trafficking, connect the client with services. We'll talk about this throughout, that it's important to work in multidisciplinary teams with other agencies, law enforcement, social services, domestic violence centers, because as we talked about, there is that overlap sometimes. We just need to make sure that we are we can't solve this whole human trafficking problem, and victims of trafficking need a lot of different supports. And so as the attorney, we can't resolve every issue they have, and we need to make sure we're connecting them to other organizations and supports to address all of their needs and not just their legal needs.
Correct.
Okay. Next slide, please. So continuing with the role of family law attorneys, after that initial assessment, of course, we want to keep continued contact with the client. And that is one of our ethical duties as attorneys, is to stay in touch with our client and keep them updated. I would say it's even more important with victims of crime, but trafficking victims especially, just because traffickers can try to exert control, manipulate the victim back into the scheme, use the legal process, as Bette mentioned, to really make this, to coerce them back into the scheme. And so we need to make sure that we're engaging with them as much as possible, keeping in contact with them, providing supports throughout the process, not just at the beginning or at the end, and understanding that this process, the legal process, is very likely re-traumatizing for the client. And we need to make sure that we can give them a safe environment to go through this process and try to minimize or mitigate some of the re-traumatization as much as possible by being that support to them, so that they know they can come to you. You can connect them with, other resources as needed, and just make sure that they have all the, services that would benefit them, and that, support services as well, connecting them. And then, legal remedies. As attorneys, this is our primary goal in representing the client, is finding the legal remedies and getting them for the client. And we'll talk specifically about some of the family law issues and possible remedies that would come up in family cases, and then touch on a couple other non-family related issues. But just understanding that human trafficking survivors are going to have a wide array of legal issues that need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed as a whole, not as siloed issues, and not as like, well, we'll deal with the family and then we'll deal with the immigration. We're not, if you're a family law and an immigration expert, great, you got that. But if you're only one or the other, that's why, we talk about collaborating, connecting with other attorneys, consulting with other experts, and making sure we're addressing or looking at their case and their issue as a whole and not in little pieces. Documentation is important in general as attorneys, but specifically with trafficking, we want to make sure we keep good records of our interactions so we can keep everything straight. And if in the event there's some sort of legal action necessary in the future, we've got good documentation to protect ourselves and to protect our client. And then safety. Yeah, go ahead.
Emily, just on the documentation, it's more about us being that client's documentarian of what's happened to them. Okay. Right. We need to be able to document, because when they're telling us the story, they may still be in active trauma. They may be suffering from complex PTSD or any kind of, issues that may prevent them from telling the story that we need them to tell so that we could get them the help. So as we're gathering that information, let's make sure that that we're very good about keeping records, because we may be the person that has the information that we're able to put that story together for them. And that's going to become invaluable later on, just the keeping the records for them so that they even begin to understand what's happening from a legal perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Bette. And I don't go into it too much in this presentation, but there is something called flooding that I touch on a little bit later that is a trauma response. And it happens a lot, especially with continued or complex PTSD or repeated trauma. It's something where the brain really doesn't store these memories in any sort of linear thinking place. So everything just kind of gets dumped, and details will come out in one meeting, and then some other details will come out in another meeting. And it's our job, if we have to keep a good record to assist the client in that storytelling, like Bette is saying, to really make sure that we're getting all the facts straight and that we can lay the case out clearly for the court when it comes time for that, because the client is flooded with what happened to them and they're not the best situated to really give a linear story. We can parse out what the court needs to know, what needs to be presented and what order to do it in, so that we can really help the client in getting their story out in a way that the court can really understand.
Right. And obviously we're not mental health professionals, but that's part of the support services, right?
Yes.
If the person needs to talk, if the survivor needs to still talk to a therapist, a mental health professional, because they need to talk to someone so that they can process some of that, so that they are able to tell us exactly what happened. We want to make sure we get them that first before we're trying to get the documentation or get their story, because again, we're trying to avoid trauma, right? Let's wait until they're ready. We'll talk about that later in some of the questions for clients.
And that goes into safety planning too. We are not domestic violence advocates at a certified DV shelter. We're not, safety planning experts. We are attorneys. And so we should be a part of whatever safety plan is created, but we're not telling you all to go out and create safety plans, but we do want to participate in the safety planning process, refer them to people who are experts in creating safety plans, and be a part of that safety plan as much as possible. All right. And then, we have what else? If anyone has any thoughts of other kind of roles we have for identifying and supporting survivors, just kind of get your thinking caps on and make sure you're, thinking about where we can identify this throughout our representation, not just at the beginning or at the end.
I think something something that could fall under what else is just practicing our non-judgment when it comes to survivors of trafficking, because they're gonna have some things in their record that historically, right, people may have deemed as negative, but it's all been part of a trafficking scheme. So they've been victimized by those same actions. So a lot of times, if we want to build rapport with them, we need to have like neutral faces, not make faces, and make sure that we're making them feel like they can tell us, not just that that we're going to keep, keep their information safe as attorneys, but also that, that we're a safe person when we're not going to be like, oh, why did you record those videos, or why did you agree, or or making them feel guilty for that. So I think that they're not going to open up about some of their other needs. We really have to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And, just with to add on to what you're saying, Betty, non-judgmental approach to these clients and to our clients in general. But I think like it is not our job to decide what choices we would have made if we had been in their position. And I don't think that it's possible for any of us to really put ourselves in someone else's shoes, because we didn't grow up like them. We didn't have the life they had. We didn't, end up in the circumstances they ended up in for whatever reason. And it's not our job to decide whether that was by their choice or fault or right or wrong or what we would have done differently. It's our job to represent them and figure out how to get them through this case. And, judgment, it should be reserved, and we should not pass it on our clients in general. But, especially like you're saying, Betty, there could be some drug use, there could be some behavior that maybe they're not even proud of, or however you want to say it. It's not our job to decide what they should or shouldn't have done in their situation. It is our job to help them get through the case and, represent them throughout the process. So I think that a lot of times people kind of get into like maybe a little bit of a savior complex, where it's like, well, I got to save this person from the situation that they were in and pluck them out and bring them to safety. And that's great.
If
That's
only they would listen to me.
Right. And it becomes very paternalistic, very like, well, you don't know what's best for you, I know better. And that's very disempowering. And it's not true. We know the law better, but everyone is an expert in their own life. When I worked in DV advocacy, we talked about survivors are the expert in their lives. And I think we have to approach our clients that way, because otherwise they're not going to trust us, and they're going to think that, we think we know better than them. And so they maybe won't come to us when there's something they're not so proud of. They might not share information that they're maybe ashamed of for whatever reason, or it really hurts that rapport between us and the client, which really hurts our representation of them and our ability.
And that's bad lawyering, right, Emily?
Yes.
And that's bad lawyering. That's not, you're not doing your due diligence and competence and all that stuff, if the client's not able to open up to you about what's actually happened. You may be causing harm in that moment. Right. So next slide, please. Next up, we're going to talk about red flags and why we don't talk about red flags. We don't talk about red flags. Vulnerabilities are not the same as red flags. Red flags are more like checklists, right? It's what people a lot of times come to me, hey, I want to help screen people. I want to help find trafficking in my cases. Like, what are those red flag indicators? Well, no, we don't want to be using those. Remember, we want to be looking at the vulnerabilities. They're not the same as red flags. The red flags, they're a tool for identifying human trafficking, but really they're flawed because it fails to intentionally build the relationships with the survivor. They're rooted in discriminatory assumptions that rely on stereotypes, right? You can imagine, somebody who's being sex trafficked and, on the street, prostitution, or foundationally racist and gendered and poverty shaming in nature too. It's like if you see a couple of red flags, right? Quote, red flags. Or imagine if you're now seeing some vulnerabilities, you can't assume that because those things a person has those vulnerabilities, they're being trafficked. I would be horrified to go up to someone and be like, oh my God, I think you're being trafficked. And they're like, no, that's just, something else. Especially if they were basing that off of racist, gendered, and poverty shaming, presumptions. So it definitely may be re-traumatizing, and it also will help the survivor feel judged, and we don't want that. So The red flags see people as a checklist, right? Hey, if I have these many out of this many, then we have human trafficking. And if not, what? People don't get services. Yeah, we want to look at the whole person. Sorry, I was just looking. I think I've gone through everything here. Yeah, the focus should be on noticing and referring, not in making assumptions related to identity. Okay, not if someone you think is looks like they might be a survivor, maybe somebody that's being trafficked. It's not about that. It's about noticing and referring, right, to help support them, because most people won't even know that they're being trafficked. They may not have ever heard that or thought about that before. Next slide, please. So if we don't use the red flags, then what do we use? You know, I know we could talking about the vulnerabilities, but the new framework is supporting the whole person. Next slide, please. And how we do this is by shifting our focus and shifting the way that we approach survivors, and even in our questions and even in our intake, right? We want to make sure that the question I'm asking is a question I'm asking informing me whether or not the client is experiencing trafficking. And is it my role to know that right now? We are attorneys. We want to know everything about our case. If y'all were like me, super nerds, you know everything about your case. And with human trafficking survivors, or with people that have trauma, you know, frequent trauma or great trauma or complex or whatever, it's like sometimes it's not our job to know that information yet. So, you know, one example of that would be when I'm talking to a client and I know that they've given me enough to know that there might be some potential human trafficking, but I know that it will be another community partner that will be taking on that case. I would stop the interview at that point, provide, you know, that information, get their permission, and then let that attorney do the interview, because I don't need to be asking them that. And then the social worker is going to be asking them that. You know, I don't need to know it just yet. You know, just go off of what you have. Would asking these questions help build trust and rapport within my role with that client? And when I talked about role with a client, you know, even though we are not mental health counselors, right? We know all the things that we're not for clients. The truth is that if you're working with a survivor of trafficking, they're really going to cling on to you. They're going to look to you for support. Sometimes, you know, they'll need some basic information, but just keep in mind that it's not just the attorney relationship. They're going to look to you for a lot of guidance. So, you know, again, are you building that trust, or do they feel like you're not going to be there to support them because this is the only piece of the case that I'll be able to handle, and then I'm going to pass you off to someone else? You know, we want to support the whole person, right? How do my questions provide the most informed response to the client's needs? And is the question I'm asking duplicative and can it cause re-traumatization? We already talked about that. We want to make sure that we're asking the questions just the one time. Next slide, please. So, for example, we want to ask questions such as, how have you been caring for yourself when you're hungry or you need somewhere to stay? Why? Because that helps us to make sure that they're having their basic needs met, right? Or that they're accessible. So if they say, oh, I don't know, I've been sleeping in my car, we need to refer them to social services. Or, hey, you know, I've not been sleeping well because my ex keeps, you know, calling me in the middle of the night to see if I'm with someone. Okay, you know, again, they might need some help with that. Or maybe they need housing. A lot of them are going to need housing. Or maybe they need some mental health. And we'll get to that next. But that would be a good question, as opposed to, how have you been caring for yourself? Would be the new question, as opposed to, have you ever had sex in exchange for food or shelter? That's old framework, right? That would be exposing the person to shame. They maybe don't trust you enough to say that they've had to engage in sex work, or that they've been forced to do those things to keep themselves safe. They may not be at that point yet. So, and the point was, we want to make sure that their basic needs are met first, right? We need to build that rapport. So another question would be, do you understand your rights as a worker? Would you like me to explain them to you? As opposed to, does your employer control your wages or housing or transportation? Why? Because what we want to know is, do they have any needs for help with the work, wages, or any other victim rights, or potentially, wages or victims' rights they may be owed, or perhaps even immigration if it turns out to be trafficking. But another question would be, what would you like to change about your housing or employment, as opposed to, are you forced to live where you work? right? Which is another stereotype. You're imagining somebody out either in a field working and living in a little trailer, or somebody that's maybe being trafficked in a nail salon and they're sleeping in little rooms or whatever, or massage parlor, or, based on stereotypes, right? Just all of those that I just mentioned, stereotypes, erase them, go back, delete. But and then finally, do you have any challenges due to past convictions or current charges, as opposed to do you have any charges of felonies? Why? Because you want to know about how that's impacting them, and maybe they do. And if they are being trafficked, maybe we can look at an expungement for them, right? We can address the barriers that are created for them in the legal system. Next slide, please. So a few other questions. Do you have any questions related to your legal status? Would you like me to explain your options to you, or refer you to an immigration attorney? Instead of asking, are you here legally or can you go back home? Those are not appropriate questions. And again, delete, delete, delete. You didn't hear me say those. So why? We just want to make sure that if they have any questions about that, you can send them to an immigration attorney if you don't practice that. And then also, when do you feel safe at work? And when do you feel unsafe at work? Or some people sometimes don't feel safe at work. Are there any times when that's happened to you? You want to address the immediate safety concerns that they may be having. And then, they may be more likely to come forward, as opposed to, is your job safe? And now thinking, oh my God, they're going to call someone, they're going to get in trouble, the boss is going to know, or they're going to think they're going to call whoever and they're going to show up and at the place. So that would not be survivor centered. Absolutely not. And next slide, please. I think we're ready to move to some of the potential challenges in identifying.
Yes, thank you, Betty. So some of these, we've looked through kind of how to identify, how to screen, how to talk to your clients about these issues, but there are, of course, challenges in identifying trafficking victimization, at the beginning and throughout the process, the relationship. So one of the challenges is concealment, as we talked about, Betty talked about. This kind of trafficking recruitment strategies are often sort of more less obvious than I think people often envision trafficking as. And so concealment, it's often kind of hidden. The trafficking scheme is really not as obvious as we think it should be or would be. And so you just don't recognize it right away. That's why we have to look at, friendship and grooming. What does grooming look like? What does coercive control look like in these specific situations and relationships? And then also that as part of the trafficking, and Betty talked about this in the wheel, that many victims are isolated from their friends and family as a function of the trafficking, and also it gets them in the trafficking and it keeps them in the trafficking. So there's a lot of isolation that stops or prevents victims from accessing resources and reaching out for help. Fear and coercion are another challenge that really prohibits or kind of gets in the way of victims accessing services and reaching out. The victims are often controlled through threats, violence, psychological manipulation. And so they are afraid to come forward. They're afraid to reach out for help because they have been subjected to very real threats about what would happen if they do reach out, if they do try to leave, if they do try to get help. And so they're hesitant to disclose their situation because they don't want to deal with any potential retaliation. They've been threatened, and kind of controlled and manipulated through this scheme. Stigmatization. Some trafficking victims are often stigmatized or criminalized due to their involvement in, unlawful conduct, sex work, drug use, those things, even though maybe it wasn't their choice and that was part of the trafficking scheme. So of course we don't want to blame them for it, but there is a lot of stigma that comes along with drug addiction, and it will inhibit people from coming to services to reach out for help because they are worried that they're going to be judged and stigmatized and, judged for their criminal history, not supported because of maybe things quote unquote, look bad on their record or whatever it may be. And that's another reason why we want to make sure that we approach this non-judgmentally, because there's already a lot of stigma around what they've been going through. And so if they finally reach out and we meet them with judgment, that's it. You know, they're not going to come back. And insufficient training is a challenge in our identification, and also that it inhibits the amount of resources that are available, but really insufficient training. That's why we're doing this today. And we're trying to improve the amount of training there is available for these issues so that we can adequately recognize when it's going on in our cases. All right, next slide, please. We'll go through a few more potential challenges. We've got lack of trust. So because of, you know, the criminalization that they've been through, or the stigma, or whatever it may be, victims can fear law enforcement and other government agencies because of their immigration status, maybe, or just generally negative experiences with authorities. They might not trust you initially. And as you know, as attorneys, we are not law enforcement. As legal aid attorneys, we are not, you know, immigration agencies. We're not enforcement of these things. But a lot of survivors, a lot of our clients look at us as part of the system. I would argue we are not. We are fighting within it, but they don't always understand that right away. You know, we have this perceived power in this status of being an attorney, and they see us as part of the system, so they might not trust us right away. And it is our job to build that trust and to try to break down those barriers, and not just expect them to respect and trust us because of our position. Language and culture can definitely be a barrier. Language barriers, you know, that isolation, along with any cultural barriers that make it difficult to communicate what they've been through and what they're going through and navigate those systems. So that's why it's important that we collaborate with, you know, and kind of work with people of all different backgrounds and cultures to make sure that we are not stereotyping people and are not, you know, basing our assumptions in stereotypes and kind of things that are not really true, and, you know, making assumptions about our clients. There can be multiple forms of trafficking, which adds a lot of challenges to it. There can be sex trafficking, labor trafficking, you know, and we need to identify all the different types, and they could be multiple types existing in one case and with one client. So, but each type of trafficking requires different knowledge and skills and supports. So it can be a challenge in recognizing all the types that they've experienced and connecting them to experts and supports for all of those different types. And then speaking of support services, there can be limited resources, and there also can be sort of a perceived limited resources where there might be resources out there, but people aren't as aware of them, or they just don't even look because they assume there aren't resources out there. So we need more resources, and we also need to raise more awareness around the resources that are available and connect people to what we have, get to know your community and what you have available within your area for your clients that have been experiencing trafficking.
Absolutely. And that's part of the education. Remember, that was the first thing that we talked about. And thank you guys again for being here today and wanting to learn more about human trafficking. You're definitely going to be making my job easier. That's my mission, is just helping people, attorneys, being able to help identify trafficking and helping support the survivors. But Alexis, can we have the next slide? So next, we're going to talk about some common misconceptions of human trafficking victimization. I'm not going to stay on these too long because at this point, you guys know better, right? It's not just a criminal matter. Human trafficking goes undetected the majority of the time. So it's rarely reported to police. So how is it going to be like a criminal matter? But very few of those cases actually get prosecuted or people get charged with human trafficking. There might be other cases, there might be other charges against, you know, traffickers, like domestic violence or, you know, a battery or stalking or some of the other things they've done, but actual trafficking is not that prosecuted. So it's not really a criminal matter. It's in our cases, it's in, they're having kids together and they're, you know, the children are being used. Physical restraints, obviously, psychological coercion and emotional coercion are ways to keep people doing things against their will, so you don't have to have physical restraints. And voluntary participation, you know, some people believe that that at some point the victims participated out of their own volition, But even if they were usually deceived or lured or forced into trafficking against their will. So, there may have been some trickery that got them in that situation that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten themselves into. Next slide, please. Another common misconception is that commercial sex equals consent, right? Or, and it does not, right? Just because you see somebody doing some sort of online sex work, and as I've heard defendants say, look, they're smiling, they're totally doing whatever. I have a consent written. If it was an agreement written during using coercive tactics, clearly that wasn't done voluntarily. So so if a client is disclosing, just as a practice tip, if a client is disclosing that they're doing any kind of sex work, even if it seems like it may be voluntary, just make sure that there isn't some sort of pressure that's being put on there. Oh yeah, me and my husband or me and my partner, we have this website, and there's a lot of couples out there making money on OnlyFans and homegrown pornography, and sometimes that's actually our clients or potential clients that are being sex trafficked. So just keep that in mind so that you can ask those questions, right? And foreign national myth is that it's only a foreign national issue, but even though foreign nationals definitely do get targeted as well, but they also are trafficked, and we can see that when it includes transportation. When people are brought to the U.S. for labor purposes, that's also that can fall under labor trafficking or whatever, sex trafficking as well. But also people that are here being trafficked. You could be a U.S. citizen, born here, and still be trafficked. Like I said, 40% of children being trafficked, it's familiar trafficking. So it's not just a foreign national issue, and it's not just little girls and women. Remember, I put that as a vulnerability, but it doesn't only happen to them. So don't think, oh well, there's just a man in front of me, or LGBTQ youth, or a non-binary person. It's not just limited to that. Next slide, please.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we're going to talk about family law issues that are faced by survivors, potentially kind of exploring custody and visitation concerns that might come up in your cases, divorce and spousal support issues. We'll talk about protective orders, and then we'll look at a case study to try to apply some of what we're learning today to some hypothetical situations. So next slide, please. We're going to start talking about custody and visitation concerns. If you're a family law attorney, your client comes to you, there might be some trafficking. They have children with the trafficker. You're going to end up in, custody court at some point, paternity, divorce with custody, whatever it may be. You're looking at how to navigate custody and visitation concerns when there's been trafficking. So one of the big pieces about this is how the trafficking impacts parental rights, both on the survivor's end and potential parental rights of the trafficker. If they're not married, there's, we know some new laws about paternity and father's rights. If the trafficker is the father, and is on the birth certificate or has signed a voluntary acknowledgement, or all the different ways that can be established without a paternity case, they have rights as the father right away. And so that's going to affect how the survivor can navigate the system and what they can do to protect themselves and the children. And then on the survivor's side, there could be, and I'll talk about this in a minute, some dependency involvement. Their parental rights could be impacted based on a past, criminal history, drug history, both mental health, whatever that might have come as a result of the trafficking scheme and the victimization, then impacts their rights as a parent, and could potentially subject them to some custody issues as far as it relates to maintaining, custody and visitation with their children. And as we, as family law attorneys, know, the best interest of the child rules. And so we have to find a way to frame what has been happening and fit that into the best interest factors to show the court that it is best for the children to stay with the protective parent, or, whatever the client is asking for, whatever is best for these children, that we can advocate for that within the factors that we have to work with. Some of the factors that are notable here, there's moral fitness can be used against the client if they've had arrests for domestic violence, or a lot of times especially what I see in domestic violence is that the victims will get arrested. Law enforcement gets called. The batterer is cool, calm, collected, in control of themselves. The victim, who's just been, kind of revved up and really antagonized until they kind of lose control of themselves, they are the ones that get arrested. But they weren't the one, who was in control of the situation and had all the power and was the trafficker or the abuser, but they've got an arrest. They potentially have a conviction that could be used against them in the best interest analysis. And so we have to really find ways to frame this to show that they're not morally unfit. It's because of what was done to them. And there's also, yeah.
Sorry, and I was going to say that also with human trafficking, you spoke of domestic violence, which also there's an intersection, obviously, with domestic violence and human trafficking. But with trafficking survivors, they may have charges for other things, right? They may have, charges for sex work. They may have drug charges. They may have resistant arrest. We've seen a lot of things, forced robbery or shoplifting, there's a lot of other charges, and not the robbery one, but a lot of those can be addressed through a human trafficking expungement we'll be talking about briefly later.
Yes,
as it relates
absolutely.
To that.
Thank you, Betty. Definitely. And there's also, in the best interest of the child analysis, we have this new, as of July, 50-50 presumption that it is presumed to be in the children's best interest that the parties share 50-50 time sharing and shared parental responsibility when there has been one parent trafficking another parent. We have to, if this is what the client wants, we have to find ways to rebut that presumption. It is rebuttable, but it's a burden that we have to overcome. And we really have to find ways to present the facts in a way that rebuts that presumption, if that is what's best and that is what the client wants. I'm saying that because it is not our decision what is best in the client's circumstances. It's always important in our duty as attorneys to listen to our clients and zealously advocate for what they want within the confines of the law. So, if the client for some reason is fine with 50-50, we don't have to worry about rebutting that presumption. But these are things to consider in, when there are safety concerns and there's trafficking. What does the client want and how can we accomplish that? And if it is not 50-50, if it's supervised visits or, whatever it may be, that is a presumption we now have to rebut. But along with those laws also came Grayson's law. And that is something that expands the violence factors to allow the court and to require the court to consider, violence against the parent or intimidation and, threats that make the parent believe that they are in imminent danger of becoming a victim of violence to be seen as harm to the children. And so we really need to, we keep talking about there's this overlap between domestic violence and trafficking. Grayson's law doesn't specifically reference trafficking, but it's violence. There's victimization involved in that. And we can really try to fit what has been happening and what the trafficking parent has been doing to the victim parent into this Grayson's law kind of analysis.
That's a good point, Emily. Human trafficking is not listed. We're talking about human trafficking in family law, but it is not under the family law statute yet, right? But obviously, if there's domestic violence, then that would apply. And certainly the course of control that we see under Grayson's law that we see with trafficking cases. So, it's like baby steps, but there's nothing in the statutes yet.
Yes, that's right. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the protective orders too. You kind of got to fit them where they fit in the law, and there is that overlap a lot of times in the strategies, at least, of maintaining power and control. And so it very well could be trafficking, but if you have to focus on, this is violence, this is abuse within the definition of Grayson's law, that's the argument that we need to be presenting to benefit the client. There's also modification considerations to be made during this custody process. There could be issues with reopening cases. Let's say the survivor parent didn't get custody for whatever reason. They might have issues with reopening the case for a modification based on maybe some sort of rehabilitation that they've gone through. There's some case law that talks about how that's not something that path is really not open for human trafficking victims. There's also current case law, some conflicts within the DCAs, but there's some developing case law about step-up plans is what I always called it, but before the final judgment, before you even get to a modification, the idea of providing a rehabilitation plan or a path for someone to go from maybe supervised to unsupervised to 50-50, whatever it may be. And that was the case law that was coming out was when it involved the substantial material and unanticipated change in circumstances. Of course, now unanticipated has been removed from the standard. So we're kind of still waiting to see how things pan out and whether that makes it easier or harder to reopen a case to rehabilitation. There's things to think about, like, does the survivor need the rehabilitation, or is it important to make it harder for maybe the trafficker to come back and reopen the case after maybe they've done whatever they may, gotten sober or whatever, might have weighed against them in the best interest analysis. We kind of got to think about, can we get the client rehabilitated if that's needed? And how can we try to make sure that the trafficker can't continue to drag them back to court on modification after modification, just to do that litigation abuse, as we talked about. And then relocation is something to think about too, because we know the relocation prohibition once there's a case filed involving custody. So survivors often want to, there's that isolation. They're not near their family and friends. Maybe they want to go somewhere outside of 50 miles before anything gets filed. That's something that you want to talk to them about, because once that's filed, there's a whole hoops that you have to jump through, and there's no guarantee, and it's a whole process. So the conversation needs to be had. What are your legal remedies and what are your goals, and do they line up? And should you move before you file, or is that really going to even, are they going to make you come back? Things like that. So those are all things to think about in that process. Child support we've got is the right of the child, of course, and is the obligation of the parents to support their children. And so if some things you want to think about are in considering back child support, retroactive child support considerations, the trafficker benefited from the scheme and exploitation of the survivor parent. Is there an argument that they should have been responsible, that there's some, retro child support there, that we can backdate child support to 2 years ago when they were still exploiting the victim parent? Is there an argument there for retroactive child support? And then also on the flip side of things, if the survivor parent is the one who maybe ends up having to pay child support, but they are also undergoing maybe a lengthy rehabilitation process, is the court going to impute income to them if they're unable to work because of the rehabilitation? Is that voluntary? Is that, they had to undergo rehabilitation because of the victimization? They didn't choose to be trafficked. How voluntary is that? And is there an argument there to get out of the imputation of income, even though it is both parents' obligation to support the children? There's really a lot to kind of parse out there. And then dependency, as I touched on in the beginning, many trafficking victims, the children, the victim themselves, both, they end up in dependency court. There could be because of substance abuse, criminal involvement. There's a failure to protect, kind of maltreatment can be used against survivor parents, and then the children can be placed with the trafficker. There's a lot to kind of figure out with that, about really making sure that the courts understand who is the abuser parent in the situation, who is putting this family in danger, and where is the accountability really need to be focused, and who needs the support to support the children. I talk about, like, supporting the protective parent is the way to support the children. And so, just kind of how can we help them navigate this process?
Perfect. Because next slide, please. And that brings us to, sometimes the traffickers are married to the survivors. And anybody that's here, legal aid, that does a DV work, family law work, is going to be abusive marriages that you're helping to dissolve. And as you know, Florida is a no-fault state, but that doesn't mean that a trafficker or an abuser may try to use tactics to delay or make things very difficult for the survivor, right? They could be filing a bunch of motions or sanctions or keeping the children, or or harassing, but just borderline, and things to keep abusing the survivor long term. Now they can also like fail to provide mandatory disclosures, refuse to provide it. They could just really delay things. So even though they can't stop it, they can still delay it. Also, another issue might be residency requirements for clients. If your client had to move or they had to go to a shelter and they don't have a permanent address, they may not be able to show the 6-month residency requirement without getting a corroborating witness affidavit. Alimony considerations. As you all know, alimony law changed last year in Florida. So one of the things that the current law doesn't really envision, right, is involuntary servitude, where one person is putting all their sweat investment, and somebody's been brought here now. They're living together and they're working 6-7 days at the other person's premarital property, right, or premarital business, and then when they're getting divorced 3, 4, 5 years later, now what do we do with this alimony law, right? I mean, it's saying that under 10 is still a short-term marriage. Under 3, you don't even qualify for alimony. But what if you were working? What if the survivor was working the whole time and then they don't get any of that back, right? Because it's all marital property and it's all equitable distribution. So there are no wages owed for the forced labor, and that's something that we could possibly look at. And also alimony for short term, it is capped at 50%. So I'm just saying that the way that it's currently set up, it might not be enough to support survivors. Also, another issue would be the equitable distribution. There, you need to be able to overcome a presumption of 50-50 split of marital property. And the fact that the trafficker profited off the survivor's labor should come into play, just to make the circumstances more equitable. And one of the things that I found out in doing my research for this presentation, my little nerd, was that Maryland law family law provides for a spouse that was trafficked to get remunerated for that labor. I want to investigate that more because I'd love for them to be some protections, because Emily and I both work with survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence and other crimes, but with domestic violence is so encompassing, right? And then if they were married, there's so many extra layers that are not really, the statute is currently not prepared to address. But so yeah, we'll work on that next, guys. You get my information is going to be in here, so anybody's got an interest in working with survivors of human trafficking, or more information on how best practices or any other resources, you can feel free to contact me. Florida Legal Services, like we said before, my project is across Central and Northeast Florida, but Florida Legal Services does provide services statewide. So we'll be happy to help in any questions you may have. And then there's also civil liability. It's a TVPRA, and also Florida law has its own civil liability for traffickers, for victims of trafficking, so they can sue their traffickers for profiting off their labor, and then also potential criminal liability. Those get investigated, and it could be at a federal level or a state level. So just remember, there's 2 definitions of it, and obviously they work together. I have seen people get charged for state, federal, and then Interpol was looking for them, or something, international. I don't know what goes after that, but there can be multiple layers. Like we said, there's several laws, right? You saw it. It started with the Palermo protocols. Okay, next slide, please.
Yeah. So the other thing, family adjacent, family involved type area of law that we wanted to cover that could come up in your cases are protective orders. We've got civil injunctions for protection, and then there are also criminal no contact orders. For the injunctions for protection, there's no human trafficking injunction, but there are 5 other types of injunctions. So you really want to look at the relationship between the victim and the trafficker, and is there a way you can fit this into one of these injunctions? There's, the domestic violence injunction. Are they married? Do they have children together? Have they ever lived together? Can you fit it into that domestic violence injunction to get them some protection? And if not, does it fit into stalking? Is there substantial emotional distress? We know that's a difficult one, but can you fit it into there? Or has there been sexual violence, dating violence, if they've never lived together or don't have children or aren't married, but they have some sort of relationship there that is beyond maybe some kind of romantic or intimate relationship that the trafficker may be forcing on them, but that you can fit it into the dating violence definition. Or of course there's repeat violence is kind of the last option if there's nothing else that fits as far as their relationship. But then of course you're going to be making legal arguments about how what they have done, what the trafficker has done, fits into the definitions of the violence defined within each injunction. So it's just something to really look at and analyze. Is this something that benefits them? And if they are married and or have children together, there will be time sharing ordered in the injunction. Whether that's 100% to the survivor or not, that's something to consider, especially as we talked about with the parental rights, new paternity father's rights. If they're not married and there's no time sharing order and the survivor wants to relocate, maybe an injunction is not the best idea because there goes the custody order, or maybe it is because the survivor wants some kind of order that says this is what the time sharing should be and this is the only way, the fastest way to get one. It's just things to consider with injunctions. And then criminal no contact orders. It's not often criminal or always criminal, but if there is some kind of corresponding criminal case, there could be a criminal no contact order put into place that is very similar in the protections as an injunction, but it is tied to that criminal case. So is that enough? Is there also a need for an injunction? Is the criminal case potentially going to get dismissed? What are the kind of implications with that? And these are all part of safety planning for human trafficking, and understanding that safety planning for human trafficking is not the same as safety planning for domestic violence. The recovery programs are often a lot longer. They're 18 months to 3 years or even more. The domestic violence centers often have maybe a 3-month stay maximum. That's not going to be enough support for the human trafficking survivor. I would argue it's not enough for a domestic violence survivor either. But the point is that it is a long recovery and rehabilitation process, or supports are needed for a long time. And so those safety plans need to be different and tailored to the victimization that they have experienced. And it is always important to make sure that who we are referring them to and how we are referring clients involves voluntary participation in services. Survivors of human trafficking should not be mandated to go to some sort of service or participate in some sort of rehabilitation. It should be a voluntary services model, because that is empowering, and that mandating them to services indicates that there's something wrong with them. It's their fault, that they, what happened to them is their fault and they need to fix their behavior. And that's not the case. The case is that they need support, maybe mental health, to process what has happened to them, but not to fix. There's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. It's just important to get them connected to services that they need to help them move on and get out of the situation safely. So we'll go to the next slide. I think now we're going to kind of look at some facts and try to do a little bit of applying some of what we've learned so far to some case.
Yes, I'll read this now, but one final note. I was waiting for you to be done talking, and of course my ADHD jumped in, and then it just jumped out of my mind that with the safety planning, the voluntary service model, is that that the trafficker has been telling them what to do. That's what they did. They controlled everything about them. So like the last thing you want to do is be telling them you have to do this. And I'm very emphatic when I talk to people. I get very excited. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the thing. Like I would, and I pause myself. I'm like, my advice would be to do this. This is obviously it's up to you, because you don't want to be forcing or anything that feels like coercive or anything like guilting or anything like that, right? It is absolutely their choice. So anyway, thank you. So the case study, just keep in mind well, first of all, I know that we're running a little bit behind on time, so we'll try to get through some of these as quickly as possible. But keep in mind, please, that we didn't pull these out of thin air. These are all things that have happened or do happen in cases. So even if they sound really far-fetched, they're not. Okay, these are fictional. These are not based on any one case, but these things have been found in cases. So when Taylor was 16, their parents kicked them out of the house for being trans. Taylor was then lured into a domestic sex trafficking scheme, and the trafficker impregnated them. They also became dependent on prescription medication, which the trafficker provided. At birth, the child tested positive for prescription drugs, and DCF opened an investigation, which led to a dependency case being filed because of Taylor's substance use and dependence. The child was placed with the trafficker, but Taylor's parental rights were not terminated. Taylor spends over for 3 years and comes to you to try to get custody of their child. What kind of issues do you all see right now? And Emily, I'll just let you
Yeah,
again.
absolutely. Yes.
And you guys can prop information into the chat as well, but
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Betty. Please put any thoughts you have into the chat, but I'll kind of point out a couple things that jump out to me as far as some things that maybe I might still need to know. We've got this dependency case, but Taylor still has retained their parental rights, but do we need to get back into court on a modification? How can we rehabilitate Taylor for the court? You know, they're sober. They've done what they need to do to get back on their feet, but we have to prove that to the court. And you know, 3 years, is that long enough for the court to believe that it's that they are safe for the children? What kind of time sharing are we even looking at? Are we looking at, you know, they want to get custody of their child? What does that mean? Does that mean 100%? That's going to be a huge battle, a huge, you know, hill to climb. But the child was placed with the trafficker, as we talked about.
trafficker.
And so there's a lot of safety concerns already, you know, that this child needs support and needs to be returned to safety as soon as possible. Taylor's ready for that. How can we get them back into court to really get this situation kind of turned back on the way it should be for the child's safety?
Yeah, and if you notice any of the vulnerabilities, you know, Taylor was trans and they were 16 when they became unhoused.
Right.
So they were very young. The trafficker also made them dependent on prescription medication, which is one of the tactics that they use to keep them in the scheme, right? And then they have a child with a trafficker, so now they're dangling the child in front of them, you know, probably use that. I mean, that's not in the fact pattern, but I definitely have seen that before, where the survivor or the victim has been staying with the trafficker just so they can be near to the children. And of course, the trafficker is the one that's put them in the situation or is still forcing them in the situation that's casting them in the bad light in the dependency case, while at the same time looking fine.
Yes. And there, I do see a comment about, you know, it's been 3 years since birth. What happened at the dependency proceedings? Was there no reunification? You know, we need a lot more information about what happened in the dependency case. Did the court retain jurisdiction? Where are we looking at going back in? You know, how can we, what are the steps to rehabilitation? What happened in that case? And where do we go from here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily. Next slide, please. Now, next, we're going to take a look at the related legal needs, immigration, expungement, victims' rights, and we're going to have an additional short little case study. Next slide, please. So we have immigration and related relief. Now, the related relief is a TVAP. Okay, TVAP is not an immigration. It's not an immigration benefit, but it is eligible for foreign-born people that have been trafficked here in the U.S. They're eligible for case management and social services, medical benefits, and food stamps. Immigration relief that may be available to survivors of trafficking, maybe T visas or U visas. Those are for victims of crime. T visas is for trafficking victims. VAWAs, if they're married to their trafficker, right, and they're a U.S. citizen, there's some relief there, or possibly asylum. Now, you want to make sure that if somebody has some sort of immigration needs, that you put them in contact. If you don't do immigration, please put them in contact with somebody who may, so that they can address like all of their needs, and we don't accidentally do something where the divorce is pending, they're about to be divorced from their trafficker, and now, you know, there's a 2-year window for immigration relief and we can't get that final order with the divorce. So just be mindful to investigate all those needs ahead of time. Next slide, please. There's also the human trafficking expungement. Florida has a very broad human trafficking expungement law. And if anybody here is familiar with regular expungements, they're like one bite at the apple, right? And the person needed to not be convicted and several other things. But with the human trafficking expungement, you can, a trafficking survivor, if they are at the scheme and they can show that these crimes were committed while they were in the trafficking scheme, then they can apply for either vacatur or expungement of those crimes. And it doesn't, I mean, there are exceptions to this, you know, like armed robbery and murder and some things that possibly should be also still included. But I mean, arson is also excluded. But the idea behind it is that the legislatures recognize that while the person was in the trafficking scheme, they lacked the necessary mens rea to commit the act. So because they had no volition, they had no say over what they were doing. They were in a trafficking scheme. They didn't have a choice. So yeah, so that's one of the other ones. Oh, and because it is a vacatur law, it can happen also on current pending charges. It could be multiple charges in different counties, and sometimes even in other parts of the state. Obviously, we only talk about Florida, but because it is a vacatur law, they will also get their fees returned if they paid any fees to the court for any prior charges. Next slide, please.
Yes, and on the other side of things, we've got any potential criminal charges that they're facing or have faced, but also they are the victim of a crime. And so they have rights under Florida's Constitution and Florida's statutes. And these victims' rights attach at the time the victimization occurs, and they continue throughout any sort of criminal investigation and criminal process, but they have to be asserted throughout the criminal process to be really recognized. I mean, they have the rights, but they have to assert them throughout the criminal process in order for the state to really, and law enforcement to really respect those rights. I think as a practical note, they have a lot of rights. I encourage you to read through the laws that we've provided here, but generally they have a right to be treated with dignity and respect throughout the process. They have a right to be noticed, to be present, and to be heard whenever relevant, as much as they would like to be. They have a right to confer with the prosecution. The state attorney is in charge of any plea offers and the prosecution of the case, but they have a right to have some input in that. Any plea offers, is that going to include restitution? That no contact order, do they need that? Kind of providing input on what they would like to see as far as any plea offers made. They can make a victim impact statement, and they have a right to hire their own private attorney throughout the criminal process as well. So that is something that victims' rights attorneys are available. They're not. I don't know of any free ones, but it is something that, the attorney can communicate with the state attorney on behalf of the client, attend things like depositions, trial, kind of be there with them throughout the process. And that's something to consider. Is that something that you can refer them to or provide victims' rights advocacy and representation if there is a corresponding criminal case? And if not, we at least need to make sure we're letting clients know of their rights as the victim of the crime and what their options are, and connecting them with the resources as appropriate as much as they would like. And so, I think it's important, even if we're not going to provide victims' rights representation, and if we don't feel like that's in our wheelhouse or whatever it may be, they need to know that they have rights as a victim of a crime. And, here's how they are, what they are, and here's how they can exercise them. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, and we're going to, I know we're over time, but we did want to explore one more case study as it relates to maybe some of the issues that we've talked about since the family law stuff. So we have Elena, who fled Ukraine and filed for asylum in the US. She met Jeff, who was a US citizen, and he owned several high-end nightclubs. He convinced her to marry him. She fell in love. They moved in together. And then Jeff became very controlling. He made Elena work increasingly long hours in his nightclubs. He wouldn't pay her. He said, this is a family business. This is your duty as my wife, whatever it may be. He also convinced her to recruit other people to work in his nightclubs for long hours and little to no pay. Elena he got pregnant. And when she was about 3 months pregnant, with Jeff's child, the FBI approached her about allegations that Jeff was trafficking his, quote, employees. We don't know what happened with that. Then eventually Elena has come to you for assistance with the dissolution of marriage. She and the child she's had this child. They're staying at a domestic violence center and receiving services for domestic violence. So, what are some vulnerabilities you see? What are some things you need to know? And what are some issues you see presented here in this case study?
Well, just very briefly, I can just mention she came from Ukraine, and that's a war zone. So that's already a vulnerability. Also, I was thinking about language, but certainly she didn't have financial independence. She was dependent on him. 3 months pregnant, and later had the baby with the trafficker. And not just that, but she may be or he may have been using her to recruit other people. So she may be having some potential liability, criminal or civil liability, against the other people that are alleging that they were trafficked. So, there's a lot there that could be used to I mean, in this case, she didn't seem to be aware of that at all. But and just because it's exploitation doesn't mean that it's trafficking. I just want to make that point, because it does have to meet the definition, right? You need one in each of the columns. So we would obviously need to ask more questions to identify whether there has been trafficking in this case.
Yes,
Now,
absolutely.
next slide, please.
All right. So now that you know all about human trafficking, we're going to talk about some strategies for working with and supporting survivors throughout the process. So we'll go to the next slide. So here are some strategies for supporting survivors in your representation and relationship with them throughout the case. You want to manage their expectations. That goes throughout the process. At the beginning, telling them, explaining attorney and client privilege, making your roles and responsibilities clear, what you expect from them, what they can expect from you. And that's at the beginning and throughout the whole process. You want to make sure that they know, you're managing those expectations and keeping them informed throughout the process. It's empowering. It gives them a sense of control, and it helps you represent them more efficiently because they're trusting you, and they're not expecting, things that you can't deliver, or expecting things that are outside of your purview, things like that. Validating the survivor's experience is important, I think, in that rapport. And also it does say a little bit of front loading some validation and kindness really saves time on the back end and in getting the information you need to provide the representation. So I think we can be very lawyer brained. We just jump into, like, someone tells you this really traumatic story about what has happened to them, and you immediately say, okay, well, here are the weaknesses of your case. You've got drug charges. That may be true. That all may be very true, but it's not going to be an effective way to communicate with your client. It's going to shut them down. They're going to ask for another attorney in your office, or they're going to, you're going to have some push and pull between you two because you've immediately shut them down. And it takes 15 seconds to say, I hear you. Thank you for sharing all that with me. Nobody should have had to go through that, and I'm sorry that happened to you. Let's talk about what I can do for you in your case. That took barely any time, and it would break down those walls and save a lot of time in the end, on the back end, and getting the information I need to represent the client. I talked about interrupting flooding earlier, just things that some practical tips. You can have your client take some deep breaths, get them a glass of water, offer to take a little break, encourage them to engage their senses. What is something you see here? I mean, we're not mental health professionals. I'm not suggesting you counsel your clients, but if you notice that they're really just kind of flooding with information, they're not able to tell you anything that happened in any sort of linear fashion, they're getting really overwhelmed. Like, we don't want to just barrel through that and keep asking them upsetting questions until they snap. We want to give them space, take some time, change the subject to something a little bit less emotional. We need, find something else that you need to talk about. Do the UCCJEA. There's a lot of information we need that isn't so substantive about their victimization. So take a break, talk about some of that stuff. Say, we'll put a pin in this, we'll come back. Things like that. Checking in with yourself. We talked about earlier too. Don't judge your clients. Don't make strong facial expressions or reactions to what they're telling you. And that's not to say, act unfazed or whatever. There's a balance there between validating what they've been through and acting like it's the worst thing you've ever possibly heard and you can't imagine someone going through what they went through. That's really alienating, and it's going to shut them down, and they're going to stop telling you information, because if they told you something and you say, what? I've never heard anything like that. That's awful. They're not going to tell you the next thing they were about to tell you because they're worried that they're upsetting you, or they're going to be trying to protect you shield you from the information that they have to offer. And so you need to know your own triggers, make sure you're not judging them, and try to keep that emotional distance from what you're being told. And then assisting in storytelling, we kind of touched on earlier too. That's that documentation, really making sure we're creating a nice linear story to present to the court, because they're maybe not always able to do that as a trauma response. So we want to make sure that we're doing that for the client. And then finally, the last thing I would just say is that this kind of goes into validating and interrupting flooding, but never end your consultations with them crying. Do not send your client out of the office crying. Take them back to a neutral place. I usually will say something like, what's your plan for the rest of the day? Are you going to do something for yourself? You want to take a walk? Just kind of like get them thinking about what's next, because they've just spent all this time talking about some really traumatic stuff. They're thinking about the past. They're stuck in there. Try to get them out of that and send them on their way in a way that's not so emotional. Because if they leave your office crying every time, their body is going to remember that, and it's going to be upsetting before they even get to your office from, in the future. And it's going to be hard to work with them because they're going to be so traumatized every time they see you.
And not just that, they may not want to eventually, right? It may just dissuade them from, it's just too hard. Even this person that's on my side, I can barely, get through this stuff. So
Right.
thank you. Thank you, Emily. Next slide, please. And we are coming at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to have this last very clear slide. How do we support survivors? We need to understand what their needs are. And yes, we're attorneys, right? So we're going to be seeing a bunch of legal needs, but let's not forget that they're going to have other needs that are going to need to be taken care of before we can address the legal needs, right? Housing is one of them. Domestic violence shelters are very not well equipped because, as Emily said, they'll go up to 3 months, and survivors need 18 months, 3 years. Sometimes these programs are very, very long. So housing can certainly be an issue. Case management, they're going to need somebody that's going to be, please, you need to get them a case manager as soon as possible too. If there's some suspected human trafficking, and I say this because if they don't get a case manager, they're going to expect you to be the case manager as the attorney or your paralegal or your assistant or whoever else. They're going to need a lot of help. You are going to have to do some case management too. Counseling, we need to move that to the first one of the slide, because a lot of times they're still so affected, depending on when you're talking to them. Did it just happen? Are they still coming out of it? As injunction attorneys in domestic violence, you're probably getting people fairly fresh out of the relationship, but it might be trafficking, and then that might take a lot more time to unwrap as well. So in the meantime, they may need counseling so that they can get the support, so that they can start coming to terms, so that then they can help you tell their story, right? So then they can participate. So then they're not hiding away from you or the system or avoidant or whatever other trauma response they may be having. Also, life skills and empowerment, language skills, work skills, anything that can help empower them, their choice, right? Not ours. And TBAP for foreign nationals, as I said before, because that certainly does give them access to benefits that otherwise they would not have here, especially in the state of Florida, that we're not great at providing benefits for people that need them, right? So they can get Medicaid, they can get food stamps, they can get some of their basic needs met while they are rebuilding their lives, while they're getting that mental health, while they're getting those classes, those life skills. And next slide. That's what we have for you guys. What we really want you guys leaving here today is knowing that, one, that human trafficking may be already present in your cases, and I want you to be aware of what it may look like, or definitely what it doesn't look like. But if you suspect something, that you can inquire a little bit more, and that you reach out to people in your areas, right? And that because of human trafficking, you need referrals and services specific to their situation, that you really do want to become informed and learn what's out there. Again, if you have any questions, or you want a starting point, I've been gathering information for a while, so I may be able to provide you guys with some resources. If anybody wants to there's private attorneys here who want to take a pro bono case, hey, hit me up too. But that's what I have. Next slide. Any questions or comments?
All right. Well, thank you both so much. I didn't see any questions or comments that came in other than the one that Emily did address. This was a fantastic presentation. While we're here, let me actually just take my screen share down. That way we can be in a more gallery form for the audience real quick while we talk.
Thank you for doing those slides too.
Yes.
You're welcome. My pleasure. So, I just wanted to say thank you so much, just on both levels of the human trafficking and the family law. And I really echo everything you're saying about encouraging folks in this sphere to really consider holistically all of the things that their survivor client is experiencing. So while I fill up some more airtime going over the CLE code, if anybody here in the audience does have any last minute burning questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A, or because those of you who have stayed on, I will, if you raise your hand, I'll take you off mute so you can ask your question verbally if you want. So there is a question that came in through the chat. Quickly, let me do the CLE code. The CLE code is 2400018, N as in Nancy. That is in the chat for you all, and it will come with a copy of the recording, 1.5 general CLE credits, 1.5 marital and family law, and 1.5 juvenile law certification credits. So to our questions, Betty and Emily, in the Q&A, somebody asked, can an eviction be expunged in human trafficking cases? Great question.
It is a great question. Emily?
That is a great question. I was going to say, we were just talking earlier in our survivor project about evictions and expungement. So I don't know the answer to this question. Betty, do you have an answer?
No, there is certainly another law that would be at play that we didn't cover today. That is a consumer-based law. So if somebody's been trafficked and they have evidence of that, I believe that they can. It's not covered today because I'm not fully well versed in it, but they can have credit items. Like remember we talked about financial abuse, right? So if the traffickers are getting them into debt to keep them, to keep them in the scheme, then they can get things taken off their credit. And I believe that evictions is one of them. But again, don't quote me on that. We'll have to do some research and maybe we'll do another CLE on that once I figure that out. But that is a great question because that is something that we see, right? They can't get housing because of that. So certainly.
I think that is an interesting question. And I know that the question was posed anonymously. So to whoever posed the question, please, if you want to email me directly, my email's in the chat. I have a previous training on human trafficking expungements that I can't recall now if it mentions anything about this, but it might. It was from 2023. And we also do have previous trainings, I believe, on eviction expungement generally. So I'm happy to send that information to you just as additional resources. I do know from my limited sphere as well that the eviction expungement statute is pretty just like self-expressive. It really is. There's not much leeway for other than said in the actual statute. So I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you, Alexis. And with that, we are looking to, within our project, within the human trafficking capacity building project, we are looking to work on a project for expungements as well. So if anybody does get some interest in expungements, I'll be working with the people that have done some of these trainings before, that hopefully we'll be able to get more people informed. And maybe we'll do one for the credit, like I said, as well. Make sure that we can help support survivors just to get them back, just help them on their way to restoring and getting back what it was that they had before, or even beyond what they want, reach their goals. So,
and so I know we're out of time, but I will, on that note, just also echo what our state attorney speaker yesterday, Ryan, said in our prosecutorial perspectives training, that what's going on in the criminal world with your human trafficking case is on its own timeline, in its own universe, in its own world. And as legal aid lawyers, we have the ability to do exactly what Betty said, is give control where we can in the other areas of what's going on in a human trafficking survivor's life. And so I know that that's really an empowering thought for me. And I don't even, practice in this sphere, but even just thinking it, knowing that we have the ability to provide some sense of holistic care and protection and assisting in getting back some control in other aspects of life is incredibly meaningful.
And it's so important to reduce harm, because when we're not doing those things, Alexis, then we are causing more harm. If we're only taking care of one little thing and we're like, I'm just going to handle this one thing. And, and the client doesn't have housing, for example, or something else that they're desperately needing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate all that you do, taking the time to really teach us about this important subject. And thank you all all of you who came and all of you who stayed with us until the end.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexis. Bye.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.